Usually, I'll have to wait a few hours before doing a new plaster piece, especially considering that the next one that we'll be making is going to be touching the first one. So I'd like the first one to be a little bit firm and not, when plaster is recently set up, it's sort of like mushy, which I don't think is great. I like it to be, ideally I'd like it to set up overnight if I can, before starting the second piece that's going to touch it. The clay wall, which we'll talk more about how to make later in the video, comes off at this point. And to minimize cleanup, it's nice if the clay has been left out overnight instead of being covered by a bag or something like that, because the dry piece of clay comes off the plaster surface super nicely with little to no cleanup left behind except some light dusting, which we can do with a brush. This is just another reason to leave your plaster piece sitting overnight. You can see that this plaster piece has the negative imprint of the positive clay on it, of course. The clay essentially serves the same purpose that this wall of plaster now serves us as we make the next piece, except that the clay piece serves that role temporarily and then is then discarded. There's no way you could make a plaster wall this nice and even and clean freehand. There's just no way, so you really need that clay wall there to work against, to push, to make your wall against for the first piece of plaster model mold that you make. Otherwise, I think you're setting yourself up for a major disaster. So always make a clay wall if you have to make two pieces that need to bump up against each other. Even though we worked very carefully and paid close attention to keeping all the walls nice and not get plaster or burlap over the edge, we still have some stuff that went over, and now it is time to get rid of all of those using a rasp. Don't rasp with a heavy hand here, as the plaster piece is going to come off the silicone surface very easily, of course. At this point, that's a bit of an annoyance, frankly, as the plaster is a little bit fragile and its position on the silicone is very important. We have to keep it in the same place that it was made all throughout the process in order for the model mold to fit properly onto the silicone. After rasping, you should of course brush off the dust. It may not matter too much and it might be a little bit crazy, but we don't want to get a bunch of dust ending up impeding the registration between our two plaster pieces. It's always good to work clean and take the mold making very seriously, of course. It will be and is the only thing that is keeping our fragile clay sculpture alive. Sometimes you'll have a tiny nick in the plaster surface, perhaps an air bubble or something like that. An air bubble is going to manifest itself on the surface of the plaster in negative form, like a little dimple. And I had one here right at the edge where the silicone meets the plaster, which is that 90-degree corner that I told you to be very careful with and brush vigorously into to avoid air bubbles. I guess I should have taken my own advice to heart here, as I have an air bubble right in this area. For now, I'll fill this bubble with a tiny bit of clay. The clay will keep the next plaster piece we make from having plaster fill this little hole. Sometimes I'll just fill a small hole with Vaseline as well, but this time it was big enough that I was worried about the Vaseline getting mushed out of there as I'm brushing plaster over the top of it. So I decided to use clay. And the reason I did clay is because if I tried to do it in plaster, it wouldn't want to stick to this wall very well now that it is dried. Later, once the mold is opened and if the little clay falls out, I can replace it with plaster, for example, or I'm more likely to replace it with something like epoxy putty, which will bond well to the plaster and never go anywhere, and I won't have any issues with it setting up. The exposed plaster surface is somewhat dry at this point, but even with it being somewhat dry, the next plaster piece that is going to be made against it will stick to it enough to where it can ruin both pieces and, worst case scenario, keep our mold from being ever opened. In order to protect from this happening, we use Vaseline as a release agent. Vaseline is brushed across the surface of the plaster. Make sure you get every nook and cranny, no spot can be left unvaselined in order for us to guarantee that this mold will open later. Especially around the registration dimples, we can find it hard to get Vaseline. So I'll do the majority of the work with a brush, and if the brush can't get anywhere, I'll get some Vaseline on my fingers and work around difficult areas with my fingers. Now we start over again at the beginning, essentially. The Vaseline doesn't need any set time, of course, so the second it's been applied everywhere, we can begin to apply new plaster. Remember to only add Vaseline to where the new plaster will touch the old plaster, not all over the old plaster piece, only on the wall, essentially. We start the same way as before with a thin splash coat of plaster. We'll speed through this process a little bit this time, since you've seen me do it before, and it's essentially going to be the same thing again. Though we'll do a bit of an overview so that you can remember what's going on and you get to sort of repeat what and why it's happening. Some people are going to argue that you can skip this step, by the way, and go straight into burlap, which is true, but it doesn't leave you with an ideal mold that will last as long as it could if you did things the right way, in my opinion. Many professional colleagues of mine will do the practice of going straight into the burlap, but it's mostly a time-saving measure more so than anything, and I guarantee you that if one of them were paying someone to make a mold for them, they would be upset if the guy tried to save 30 minutes by skipping the splash coat step. I prefer to make molds like I'm being paid to do so, since it's an investment into the clay sculpture that I've spent around 30 to 40 hours making at this point. So even though I'm obviously not paying myself, I sort of make the mold that I would make if I got paid for it. Remember to start by brushing along the plaster wall, same as we did before with the clay wall, except that now the wall is made of plaster. We do this because we want to deal with the harder areas first, and one of the most difficult areas to get plaster into is going to be where the plaster wall meets the silicone surface at a sharp angle. Brush carefully into this gap and go over it twice or thrice in order to push out any air bubbles that might be hiding in there. Once the splash coat is set up and is firm to the touch, but before it's heating up, we will begin to apply the burlap. Burlap is pre-cut and prepared before beginning. We dip the burlap pieces into the plaster and soak them. As they come out of the plaster bowl, they are squeezed between my fingers to remove as much of the plaster as possible before applying the burlap to the surface. Less plaster in the burlap means a lighter mold, which means a better mold. More plaster does not equal a stronger and better mold. It equals a heavy mold, which will be harder to deal with once casting and will also be more prone to breaking under its own weight. I do 2 layers of burlap with every piece of burlap overlapping the one laid down before it. And I don't repeat the same pattern of application for the second layer, as not doing so increases the number of layers to 3 or 4 simply because of the amount of overlaps taking place. Careful to run the burlap up the side of your silicone and plaster walls, but do not go to the top of them. Keep the top surface of your silicone and plaster walls free of plaster and of burlap as best as you can. The easiest time to deal with burlap going where it's not intended to go is now, of course, as once the plaster is hard, you have to rasp, and dealing with it is a much greater issue. Once 2 layers of burlap has covered the entire surface, we can instantly go back into it and start building the plaster walls, using plaster that has been sitting for around 10 to 15 minutes and has gotten to the cream cheese stage. Essentially, plaster we can sculpt with, as the plaster is capable of retaining its shape and supporting its own weight. The plaster wall you make should be as tall as the wall it is made against, be it plaster or silicone or clay. The 2 top surfaces should be parallel, and the thickness of the wall should be around 1 to 2 centimeters thick. This is going to ensure good strength and keep the edge of the mold from falling apart. Most of the pressure and beating the mold will take is going to be along the edge. Make really sure that the plaster wall which is made against the first plaster wall is the same height and the same thickness as the first one. This is going to guarantee that they are of the same strength, and once the mold is laying open, one wall won't break against the other because it's weaker. If they're of the same strength, that's the way to do it. Sometimes you make your model mold so well that it almost falls off the silicone before it's finished. This is sort of a nice feature for later, but for now it's not so great. To keep the model mold on the silicone surface and hold it in place, you can take a bit of plaster, cream cheese plaster, and brush it or sculpt it over the top of the silicone wall. This will create little plaster hooks that will help the model mold shell stay put for now, stay sort of stuck. And we can easily rasp these off or break these off later once it's time to open the mold. Make sure that they don't have any burlap in them though, because if they do, then it can become a problem.